Hi, I'm Robert F. Kennedy Jr., and I'm very, very privileged and proud to have today a chance to talk to Michael Connett, who just argued this extraordinary case against fluoridation in the Northern District of California. Okay, let's talk about your lawsuit. Set the stage for that, because you brought the lawsuit, and it was brought under the Toxic Substance Control Act, TSCA. And it was a unique provision of TSCA that actually allowed you to go to trial and to depose witnesses, and actually to depose the agencies, CDC and EPA, which was extraordinary.
It is an extraordinary provision of law. It's Section 21 of TSCA.
And you're the first one ever to bring it to trial.
Yes, TSCA was passed in 1976, so 44 years ago, and our trial is the first time that a citizen group has ever taken a citizen petition under TSCA all the way through to a federal trial.
Tell us what happened from filing the petition.
Right. So we filed the petition in 2016.
With the EPA.
With the EPA. And the petition was based on this new data that has kind of come about over the past 20 to 30 years on fluoride's effects on the brain.
Oh, and set the stage. TSCA allows EPA to declare that the risks are unreasonable.
Right, so TSCA gives EPA the authority to ban the particular use of any industrial chemical that presents an unreasonable risk to human health. So we have been dealing with EPA for the past 20 years, trying to get EPA to implement a safer water standard for fluoride. We've been dealing, though, with the Office of Water at EPA, and they've been dragging their feet for years and haven't really responsibly acted to protect the public. So this act, TSCA, allowed us to sort of bypass this kind of, the foot dragging at the Office of Water and go to this separate office at EPA. And this act gives EPA the authority to straight up ban fluoridation if it presents an unreasonable risk. So in our petition in 2016, we compiled over 300 studies that have both animal studies and human studies, which have found associations between fluoride exposure and damage to the brain.
And it's more than an option. If you can show that it does indeed present an unreasonable risk, they have to ban it.
Well, they have to take some action to eliminate the risk. So our argument is, if fluoridation chemicals present an unreasonable risk when they are added to drinking water, the obvious way to eliminate that risk is just don't add the chemicals to water. So I think that's the, if if the court finds that there's an unreasonable risk, I think that's the obvious answer for the EPA. They need to ban it.
So EPA said no.
EPA denied.
After looking at 300 studies that you brought to them.
Right. The EPA denied the petition, and we then exercised the right afforded by the statute to go to federal court, and it allowed us to introduce evidence into the record that wasn't yet available when we filed our petition in 2016.
At EPA, when it came to the trial, refused to call its own scientists or any of the scientists from the federal agency, and instead hired an industry consultant firm.
The EPA does have experts at the agency on fluoride, but the EPA did not name any of those experts as experts in this case. Instead, they retained experts from Exponent, some call them rented white coats for the chemical industry. Monsanto, Dow, 3M, Syngenta, pesticide manufacturers routinely go to Exponent to basically give their chemicals a clean bill of health. I was quite stunned to see that EPA would go to Exponent to defend fluoridation and not go to any of its own scientists. And as you noted, at trial, we called as witnesses EPA's actual in-house experts on fluoride. And we asked them for their assessment of the new data on fluoride neurotoxicity. And Dr. Christina Thayer, who is currently the director of the Integrated Risk Information System, IRIS at EPA, she testified that, yes, fluoride damages the brain in animal studies. And the animal data supports the biological plausibility of fluoride causing neurotoxic effects in human beings. That was EPA's own scientist in this case. We also deposed Joyce Donahue, who is the chief scientist on fluoride at the Office of Water. You would agree that this study right here adds further reason why we need to do a reassessment of the fluoride safety standards in the United States.
I think it's a reason for doing not just the United States, I think it's a reason for doing an update to the fluoride assessment.
Everywhere.
Well, for anybody who's interested in fluoride and the need for regulation of fluoride exposure.
Right, and anyone interested in making sure that fluoride is safe for consumption.
That people are not overexposed, yes.
Right, okay. The fluoride standards today are all based on this notion that the most sensitive effect of fluoride exposure on human health is crippling bone damage and it's called severe dental fluorosis, which is this very extensive brown and black staining of the tooth enamel. That currently, those effects, crippling skeletal fluorosis and severe dental fluorosis, are currently considered by the federal government to be the most sensitive effects of fluoride exposure, meaning until you suffer one of those effects, you can't be harmed by fluoride exposure. Can't be harmed. And what Dr. Donahue admitted in this case is, actually, these new studies on fluoride in the brain warrant a whole reassessment of this entire paradigm that we have with fluoride. This notion that the bone and the teeth are the most sensitive parts of the body to fluoride exposure. And I think that's a really important admission. And I think it highlights that we are reaching a turning point in how we approach fluoride intake, fluoride exposure, how we safely use this chemical for whatever beneficial properties it might have.
And you got the same kind of damning admissions from the CDC scientists, of course.
Well, the CDC, the deposition of the CDC was very helpful for our case. It's correct to say that CDC does not have any data on the tolerable upper fluoride intake for neurotoxic effects for infants.
Yes.
Okay. And you see how the definition also includes toddlers.
Mm-hmm.
So CDC does not have any data on the tolerable upper fluoride intake for neurotoxic effects on toddlers.
That's true.
Okay. And you see how the definition also includes children?
Yes.
So CDC does not have any data on the tolerable upper fluoride intake for neurotoxic effects on children.
Right. As stated in our response to the issue on 10 and 11, we don't conduct research ourselves related to tolerable upper fluoride intake. Again, that's under the jurisdiction of EPA's drinking water, and they set maximum and minimum containment levels about notifying people when levels are exceeded.
Okay. And CDC, as you sit here today, is not aware of any data in the published literature that would define the tolerable upper fluoride intake for neurotoxic effects on children, for children.
As a rep of CDC, to my knowledge, we don't have any knowledge about that.
Okay. They admitted that they don't have any safety data on fluoridation and the brain, fluoridation and IQ, fluoridation and neurological health. They said EPA takes care of that. Well, EPA also didn't have any safety data on fluoridation in the brain in this case. In fact, one of the notable things in this case is I asked the EPA to identify every primary study that demonstrates or supports the neurological safety of prenatal fluoride exposure. EPA identified one study, but it was a study by Phyllis Mullenix from 1995, which actually shows that prenatal fluoride exposure is neurotoxic, and even EPA's experts in this case admitted that the Mullenix study shows neurotoxicity from fluoride exposure. So the one study that EPA identified to demonstrate the safety of prenatal exposure actually shows neurotoxic effects. So, but going back to the CDC deposition, the CDC representative admitted they have no safety data on neurological health for fluoride. And I asked the CDC rep about the NRC report. See, in 2006, the National Research the National Research Council, which is a authoritative institution in this country for scientific research, 2006, the NRC published a landmark report on fluoride toxicity, about 500 pages. And that report really is what got the scientific community interested in this notion of fluoride neurotoxicity. And the NRC called on the scientific community to do more research, more studies to better understand how fluoride may be affecting the brain at lower levels, such as we add to water. Based on the concerns that the NRC was expressing here, both in the neurotoxicity review and the endocrine review, there were some big potential problems from fluoride exposure that needed to be investigated, right?
I would agree with you there.
Okay. The NRC looked at this new animal data, this new toxicologic data, which was consistently finding that animals exposed to fluoride have damage in the brain, various neurochemical and anatomical effects. And the NRC concluded that fluoride does damage the brain in animal studies. And I asked a CDC representative about the NRC's findings. I walked through them. I read the various findings from the NRC that fluoride causes changes that are similar to the changes seen in humans with dementia. And I asked them, does the CDC agree with this finding? And you see the next highlighted portion in that paragraph?
I do.
It reads, the substantial enhancement of reactive microglia, the presence of stained intracellular neurofilaments, and the presence of IgM observed in rodents are related to signs of dementia in humans. The magnitude of the changes was large and consistent among the studies. Did I read that correctly?
Yes.
And CDC agrees with the NRC that this is a correct summary of the hazard.
Correct.
So CDC agrees with NRC that it is apparent that fluorides have the ability to interfere with the functions of the brain and the body by direct and indirect means.
Yes, CDC in connection with the Intergovernmental Work Group.
The CDC accepts all of the findings of the NRC that fluoride does damage the brain in animals. The CDC agrees with that, accepts those findings. I think, so we played that testimony at trial.
So you got CDC, you got EPA.
And the FDA.
And then FDA. And then you had the two scientists who are superstar scientists, Bruce Lanphier, who I've worked with for many, many years, and Howard Hu. They're conducting the NIH, these huge multi-year longitudinal NIH studies that found profound neurological damage.
Right, and Dr. Lanphier and Dr. Hu I have to, they were what are called non-retained experts. They weren't appearing on behalf of any party in this case, but to their credit, I think to their true credit as scientists, they said they felt a responsibility to explain to the court what their studies have found. They considered it a public service. And I have to say, I have immense respect for them for doing that. And what they explained to the court is they explained the extensive vetting that their methodology underwent when they applied for funding from the NIH. They explained for the court the extensive peer review that the study underwent, when the studies underwent when they submitted it to the scientific journals for publication. And these studies, there's been 2 studies now from the Dr. Who's birth cohort in Mexico City, and there's been 2 studies from the Canadian cohort that Dr. Lanphier has been working on. All 4 of these studies have found significant and large associations between early life fluoride exposure and adverse neurodevelopmental effects. They've really focused primarily on exposures during pregnancy, prenatal exposures. These aren't high, they're not looking at high levels. These studies are not dealing with high levels of fluoride exposure. They're looking at the levels of exposure that pregnant women in the United States ingest every day if they live in fluoridated areas. So the focus of these NIH studies is on so-called optimal levels of fluoride that people ingest in fluoridated areas. And they are finding significant and large effects on IQ. In fact, Dr. Lanphier and Dr. who are both experts on lead and IQ, both Dr. Hu and Lanphier have done seminal research on lead and IQ. They testified in this case that the impact of fluoride on IQ is in the same range as the impact of lead on IQ. So I think what we are seeing today, and I argued, this is one of the arguments I made in this case, that this the situation today with fluoridated water and brain development is analogous to what we once saw with leaded gasoline and brain development. You have a situation where you have hundreds of millions of people being exposed every day to a neurotoxicant that is linked to reduced IQ, ADHD symptoms, and other neurodevelopmental harm. And I think it's a very serious situation that really requires a rethink about how we use fluoride. This isn't, we did not go into this case and didn't argue about banning all fluoride. It's about how do we use fluoride safely. And I think the writing on the wall today is,
You have to ban it.
well, you have to ban it from the water supply, right? Take it out of the water. And for those people who want to use it for dental health purposes, they can get it from toothpaste and other individual products which they can spit out and not swallow.
Some of the impacts that you brought out so incredibly skillfully is, the actual mechanism of what happens in the womb. And the women, of course, we all know this. A lot of people think, well, you only get if you drink, so if you switch to bottled water, you won't get exposed. But people get exposed when they take a shower. They get exposed when they cook food. Mm-hmm. And if it's in the water supply, it's impossible to escape. But the impacts on the blood-brain barrier of the fetus and all these other mechanisms of injury that you really elucidated so skillfully.
Right. Because fluoride is added to so many water supplies in the United States, it doesn't just go into the water. It goes into countless processed beverages and processed foods, sodas, beers, sport drinks, you name it. I mean, fluoridated.
In a lot of medicines.
It's in a lot of medicines. It's getting into many products because you can't add a chemical to the water of 200 million people and not expect it to get into a lot of other places. So there's that concern. But in going to your question about sort of some of the mechanisms by which fluoride can cause harm during the prenatal period and early infancy, in this trial, it was an undisputed fact that fluoride gets through the placenta and gets into the fetal brain. And it was also an undisputed fact, this means that the EPA agreed and did not dispute this, that the blood-brain barrier, which is a protective membrane that as healthy adults and older children keeps most neurotoxicants from getting into the brain. It protects us from harmful chemicals. But prenatally, when you're in the womb and for the first 6 months of life, that blood-brain barrier is not yet developed. And so a young child in the womb or in neonatal period, if they ingest a chemical that's toxic to brain development, that chemical will get access to the brain. And that's the case with fluoridated water and fluoride. So that was an important, I think, piece of this trial, is sort of explaining to the court that we need to be very careful about exposing kids in utero and in early infancy to chemicals that are linked to neurotoxic harm.
And one of the unexpected impacts that you were able to bring out during the trial was the impact not only on brain development, but on thyroid.
It's well known and well established that if you reduce thyroid hormone levels in pregnant women, that can have an effect on the developing brain. The developing brain is very sensitive to even minor changes in thyroid levels. And with fluoride actually, back in the 40s and 50s, it was prescribed not only as a drug for preventing tooth decay, it was also prescribed by some doctors to lower thyroid activity in patients with hyperthyroid, with overactive thyroid gland. And in those patients, fluoride exposure was found to be effective at lowering the thyroid activity. So that has created a concern. Well, what about in healthy people, people who have normal thyroid? Could fluoride exposure reduce the thyroid activity a little bit? And actually, in the past few years, there have been some significant and large epidemiological studies that have found just that fluoride exposure from fluoridated water is associated with reductions and impairment in thyroid activity. So it was an issue that we discussed at the trial, and I do think it can explain in part some of the findings you're seeing on fluoride and IQ.
Now, the funny thing is about fluoride, I mean, there's so many analogies in my lifetime about chemicals that that the industry pushed and that the captive regulatory agencies then signed off on. And we can all think many other chemicals that sort of went through the same dynamic. Mm-hmm. But fluoride is kind of unique because during the 1950s, when I was a kid, everybody said, if the government is telling us this is safe, and it must be safe. But it was a waste product of aluminum smelting, right?
Right. When we started fluoridating the water. We started in 1945, first experiment in Grand Rapids, and then it sort of quickly unfolded from there. In those early days, the chemicals that we used to fluoridate water were both waste products from the aluminum industry as well as the fertilizer industry, phosphate.
And originally the refining of uranium, right?
Well, so where the Manhattan Project comes in is the War Department, Manhattan Project, they used fluoride, and they needed fluoride on a massive level to refine the uranium to make the bomb. And so what you saw in the 1940s was an explosion in fluorine chemistry by these Manhattan Project scientists who found out that this fluoride chemical and fluorine had this amazing property of helping to refine the uranium. But it was an exceptionally corrosive and dangerous chemical. And so if you look through the records of the War Department, you'll see a lot of workers in the Manhattan Project getting injured and some killed by using these fluoride chemicals. And the War Department was very concerned about fluoride pollution. And we have documents showing that communities downwind of some of the industries producing the fluoride chemicals for the Manhattan Project were suffering serious effects of fluoride pollution. Their vegetation was being damaged, cattle were being killed. And the War Department was very concerned about communities becoming concerned about fluoride pollution and actually intervened to prevent fluoride litigation at that point in time in the 40s. So the general picture that you see when you look at the history and politics of fluoride, it's very clear, is that the major industries in this country, the aluminum industry, the steel industry, the fertilizer industry, and the bomb industry, all had very serious fluoride pollution problems. And one of the consequences of that is you start to see an effect on the science that was being published at that time. And you start to see sort of a suppression of data that indicated harm to human health, because that data was damaging to the bottom line of these industries. So you sort of see in the early days a corruption of the science. And I don't think that has been fully grappled with or understood by the public health community.
And how did it go from being a waste product to all these bad industries to getting in our water?
Well, the politics is fascinating, and I still think there's some things we don't know, don't understand fully, but the Public Health Service did endorse fluoridation in 1950 before a single trial was ever completed for fluoridation. So the Public Health Service was very enthusiastic endorser of fluoridation before we had any data on safety. And that's one of the problems with with fluoridation is we started this program. You know, this is during the days of better living through chemistry, where we had we failed to appreciate sort of the potential unintended consequences of widespread dispersal of toxic chemicals like fluoride.
It wasn't ultimately a federal mandate. It was something that was recommended by CDC and the public health agencies, but the individual mandates to actually put it in water supplies came from the state governments and from the local water districts.
That's correct. It's never been nationally mandated, federally mandated. It's always been up to local communities and states. But at the same time, the CDC and the Public Health Service has very actively promoted this policy. So I don't think you would see as many communities or states, fluoridate their water without that sort of national push. As we sit here today, we are in a situation where a number of states, like California, mandate fluoridation at the state level. So any community in California that has more than 10,000 people hooked up to a water supply has to fluoridate in California. And other states have similar mandatory laws.
But there are many water districts that do not use fluoride.
Absolutely. Portland, Oregon in 2013 voted against fluoridating its water. It's the largest city in the United States that does it. Most big cities in the United States fluoridate their water supplies.
And when I was growing up, the toothpaste companies, Crest and Colgate, et cetera, advertised that we have fluoride in our toothpaste. And that's why it was put in the water, primarily to stop the development of cavities. Does it actually reduce cavities?
Well, that's a good question. So,
is there anything good about it?
Well, so certainly when we started fluoridating back in the 40s, the whole idea was that fluoride is like calcium. It's a nutrient. It's something that you need to swallow. You need to ingest it. And if you ingest it, it ultimately incorporates into the developing tooth and makes the tooth stronger for life. That was the idea. You needed to swallow it, which is why we added it to water. It's why we added it to pills. But in 1999, Centers for Disease Control came out with a statement that surprised a lot of people. The CDC said, actually, we were wrong in those early days. You don't actually need to swallow fluoride. The predominant benefit comes from the topical contact with teeth, which you can get by brushing this fluoride on your teeth through toothpaste. So I think there's certainly evidence that fluoride applied topically is beneficial to some degree in preventing cavities. But adding it to water really doesn't make sense because you're exposing your entire body to something which you don't even need to swallow. You can just put it on your teeth and spit it out. And most of Western Europe, in fact, about 98% of the Western European population does not have any fluoride chemicals added to their water. They rejected it. They have it in toothpaste, they have it in dental products, but they don't have it in their water. And World Health Organization data shows that European countries have their cavity rates are just as low and often lower than the cavity rates in the United States.
Really, that surprises me.
Yeah, in fact, and
the U.S., when I was growing up, was regarded as having one of the things that we had better than anybody else. We had the best teeth.
Right, that's true. I mean, that's definitely the perception. And you look at the sort of jokes about the British, my father's British, plenty of jokes about the British having horrible teeth. But when you look at the World Health Organization data, what you see is back in the 40s, back in the 50s, and back in the 60s, Europe had a massive problem with tooth decay, just like the United States did. So it wasn't like they've always had low cavity rates. They had very high cavity rates. But over the past 50, 60 years, they've seen a massive decline in cavities without adding fluoride to their water. So this notion in the United States, which is many dentists have, that, well, we used to have a lot of tooth decay in the United States, but then we started adding fluoride to the water and boom, now kids don't have any cavities. That notion is just completely tunnel visioned. It fails to consider the experience of other industrial nations and other Western countries.
Tell us, we're running out of time. Yeah. Tell us the current status of the case and what's going to happen now.
Right after we made our closing arguments, the court made a number of comments on the record. And the judge noted that we had presented serious evidence and that this evidence raises serious questions about this policy, fluoridation. And he also noted that the EPA, for this 3+ years of litigation, has used the wrong standard to assess this evidence. So he encouraged the parties to see if we could agree to let the EPA give this a second look. The judge would like the EPA to give this evidence a second look using the right standard of review. I did explain to the court my apprehension as someone who has tried to get the EPA to take this issue seriously for many years, that I have a concern about having this dragged out for years and I don't want to see that happen. I think we have enough evidence now to take protective action. And I was encouraged that the court responded by saying, I'm not thinking about years, I'm thinking about months. But he does want to see, and one of the points the judge should make is, a lot of the evidence that we presented at trial, we didn't present to the EPA in our initial petition back in 2016. And that's because all these NIH studies have come out subsequent to filing the petition. So the judge sort of wants to give the EPA another chance at the administrative level to consider those new studies. And so we'll see if we can reach an agreement with the EPA on that. If we can't, the judge made it clear that he has the evidence and that he will issue a ruling.
Hey, well, thank you, Michael Connett. I feel so grateful to you for taking on this battle and then bringing it to the place where you brought it. I feel like you spent a lifetime preparing for this and that you executed it perfectly. It was like Picasso, it was like Mozart, what you did on that trial. And I feel at this point like you can sit back and light a cigar and put your feet on the desk and relax for the rest of your life, and that your life was one that was well spent because of what you did in this trial. So I want to thank you on behalf of myself and millions of American children and parents who have been poisoned for generations. And I think because of your work, we're going to see an end to this.
Well, thank you, and it is an honor to be here today. It really is an honor.
Thank you, Michael Connett, and thank you for all of you in the audience for joining us today. Thank you.